Hey, all right, welcome back. Okay, let me just fire right on it here. There we go. Lecture 1.4 and a half. What the heck? It turns out I just recorded lecture 1.5, which you will see next. When I did 1.5, it turned out a little longer than I wanted it to turn out. It was about 30 minutes or so, or it is about 30 minutes or so. And so it reminded me that as I was going through this section of the textbook that this lecture will relate to, there was something I was going to talk about, but I thought, I can't really make a full lecture out of that. But now that it just needs to be a small lecture, I came back to this. And so what this is going to be is about a 10 or 15 minute lecture. And then the next one will be a 30-minute lecture. And I kind of see those as a pair I would give, for example, in a 1 hour slot next fall. Okay, so I stuck this in 1.4 and a half, stuck this between the previous one and the one that's about to come. And it's just a discussion of this distinction between psychiatrists versus psychologists. The textbook talks about it a little bit, but students always ask me this question. They always want to know. And it really kind of also allows us to talk about sort of mental health care and how it's typically done these days. So let's jump into it. So first of all, what are the distinctions? So when we think of psychiatry, this is what's going to be on the left here. The important thing to realize is there's very different pathways to becoming a psychiatrist versus a psychologist, and that explains a lot of the different approach. So if we look at psychiatrists first, they have to be doctors first, right? They have to go through med school and become a doctor, as anybody would to become a doctor. And then once they've done that, they have to do another specialized 4-year residency in psychiatry. So now they're going to specialize in psychiatry, and they have to do some extra training there. So, a lot of schooling. But the critical thing there is, they really come from the same sort of tradition and approach that medical doctors come from. And that often does include, a really a focus on physiology, a focus on biology, and the predominant way of manipulating our biology is through drugs. And so you'll see that drugs become, a big part of it. So this is what psychiatrists do. Their main duty, as suggested here, involves identifying disorders. So people come to the psychiatrist and they say, I've had the following symptoms, or I've had the following things happening in my life, or well, there's also batteries we would give them, so-called battery, not batteries that power something, but a bunch of questions, what we call a test battery. So we might test their memory, we might test their attention systems, we might, try to figure out whether their approach to thinking about things is different than other people, etc. So we would get as much information as we could as a psychiatrist, and we would try to diagnose that person. What is it that they're ailing from? Because they're medical doctors, they can prescribe medicine. And that's often their default way of thinking about something. They typically work within hospitals, and they often earn quite a bit more than psychologists because they're medical doctors, right? There's a lot of training that went into this. So, let me give you a typical story here so you have a sense. So, for example, let's imagine somebody tried to kill themselves, but they weren't successful. They are taken to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist would spend some time, talking to them about how they're feeling and what's going on. And if somebody, often, if they're thinking about killing themselves, they may be depressed. And that's probably what a psychiatrist would be looking for, signs of depression, clinical depression. And they're not hard to find. Somebody who's depressed shows, some very distinct behaviors, including things like not wanting to get out of bed, not feeling there's any sense to even live, not feeling like anything good is ever going to happen to them anyway, etc. And so with a little bit of time chatting with them, you could very quickly realize that they are depressed. And what a psychiatrist would probably do then would be prescribe something like Prozac, a drug that when you take it makes you feel happier. It is a form of a drug very similar to ecstasy. If anybody has ever tried ecstasy or knows anything about it, you know that when people, it's called ecstasy. When people take it, they feel really, really happy. There are drugs you can take that make you feel happy. And That's what a psychiatrist would give this person to help them get out of their depression, to make sure they do not try to kill themselves again. But there's a problem with that approach, and let's leave that for now. Okay, what about psychologists? Psychologists become psychologists through a very different path. They usually complete a bachelor's degree in psychology and then usually go on and do a PhD in psychology. So that's sort of like the medical training. But then they will also sometimes, if you're a clinical psychologist, you'll often sometimes do a bit of a residency as well. Around clinical psychology. Sometimes that's part of your graduate training, though. So as you go through your graduate training, you often graduate as a clinician, clinical psychologist. You provide psychotherapy. So psychologists don't use drugs. They cannot use drugs. They are not medical doctors. They are not allowed to prescribe drugs. And so instead, they tend to use various other therapeutic approaches. I'll give you an example of one of these just to be a little more concrete. Let's go back to the depression example. One of the things we know about depressed people is that they often overblow the negative things happening in their life, and they don't put a lot of attention towards the positive things. So they have what we call a bias in their cognition. They think and ruminate about the negative things in their life, not so much about the positive. So one of the things we can do is teach them about that's happening, and then we can try to support them to develop a different habit. So for example, we could even just say something like, at the end of each day, I want you to send me an email. And in that email, I want you to talk about 3 good things that happened to you during the day. Give me some details about those 3 things. I don't want to hear about anything bad. Tell me about 3 good things. Okay. If you know you're going to have to do that at the end of the day, then as you go through the day, you will be keeping your mind out for good things. When good things happen to you during the day, you'll be like, oh, this was kind of a good thing. I could maybe put that in my email tonight. And so that means you're going through the day now, kind of looking for these good things, paying attention to them when they happen and trying to remember them. Remember, your natural thing is to pay attention to the bad things and to think about the bad things and to remember the bad things. So by now pushing you to do the same with the good things, we're rebalancing that bias. We're trying to introduce a bias to make you attend to the good things. And if we can get those good things into your mind along with some of the negative things, then you may feel happier through that approach. So that's something we're going to call cognitive behavior therapy as we go through, but it's just an example of how you could try to help this person in a different way. Now, by the way, psychologists typically work either at universities or in their home. Typically when they do therapy, they have an office or they have something. That's where they do it, but it's not within a hospital. And yeah, they can earn less than psychiatrists. They do okay. Don't worry about, here we have an example of therapy over on this side. So that's the real difference between the two. But here's something else I want to highlight. When you think of what I just told you, and if you think of the time, how quick will that help be? What you probably realize is this is pretty quick, right? You can take a pill and feel better. This, you are going to have to spend some time learning those new habits of the mind. It's slower. But as it turns out, this is enduring. This is not. And so let me tell you that story. And the punchline of the story is often we'll use both of these. We'll have both of these going on. So let's just step through that story. Let's go back to the case of depression. Let's imagine someone that's depressed. We know that serotonin affects your mood states. And some of these drugs we give you are sometimes called SSRIs, Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitors. Fancy, huh? What all of that means is they're a drug that does the following. When your brain produces serotonin, it eventually takes it back. It puts it out there in the brain and then it takes it back. That's something we call reuptake. These drugs prevent the reuptake. So it puts the serotonin out there, but it doesn't take it back. And so what that means is there ends up being more serotonin in your brain, more active serotonin. And that makes you feel good. All right. So at first, the first time you take it and you feel really good and in no period of time. Here's the problem. The brain is dynamic. The brain, every drug that you take that affects the brain, the brain reacts to. And so if you are suddenly taking this drug that's making the serotonin hang out in the brain longer, what the brain starts doing is releasing less serotonin. It reacts to that, and it cuts back its serotonin output. And yes, you're still taking the drug that will, whatever it outputs, it will keep it out there longer, but it won't feel as good as it did the first time. You won't have that same hit because the brain produced less serotonin, and the brain will continually produce less and less and less if you continue. And so what happens is the person finds the drug to be not as effective. Often the doctors will then increase the dosage. And so you end up chasing dosages of this sort of drug to try to get that same effect that you had originally. And you can ultimately become addicted to this drug. And you can get to a point where you need that drug. And if you don't take that drug, you will kill yourself really quickly because you'll feel so horribly depressed. Okay? So drugs are tricky as a solution, but they are really good at the short term. They help when the help is needed most, right? At the beginning, these drugs work. So here's what we often do. I've already told you about this bias in attention. And so the notion would be that often people work with a team now, and that team can often include a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And the psychiatrist can sometimes, obviously they can prescribe drugs. And if we need this person, if this person's in such a bad situation now, that they can't even do therapy. They're so depressed, they don't give a damn about therapy. They don't want to do anything about it. Well, maybe we have to give them some of these SSRIs just to get them okay. Get them to a point where we can then do some therapy. And the therapy is what might become the long-term solution. So as quickly as we can, we wean them off the drug. Once we're sure that they're not going to sink into a deep depression again and not going to harm themselves. And instead, we start leaning a lot more on the therapy. And we see the therapy as the longer term solution, changing their habits of mind, changing the way they think. That's what's going to get them happiness in the long term. This isn't. But this can sure do it in the short term. Okay? So very often, it's common now for psychiatrists and psychologists to work together when helping somebody. Cool. So should you be thinking about being a psychiatrist or a psychologist, at least now you know the difference between the two. And, you can think about where you would like to fit into that solution of helping others who are dealing with, often distressful situations. Cool. There's the quickie. I'll leave that one with you, and I'll see you in Lecture 5 and beyond. Okay, bye-bye.